So I want you to imagine you're looking at the Earth from space at night. You're staring down at the southern half of the African continent, and there is this massive, totally invisible line drawn right in the dirt.
Right, a literal line.
Yeah, but it's illuminated entirely by human activity. So on one side of this line, if you're looking south into Namibia, the land is just glowing. You see these clusters of bright light, these radiating networks of prosperity. It's the undeniable visual signature of a modern functioning economy.
It's basically exactly what you'd expect to see over any developed area.
Exactly. But then on the other side of that exact same line looking north into Angola, it's pitch black. Just a vast, dark void.
Nothing.
Right, nothing. Now, here's where it gets crazy. If you zoom down to ground level and look at the actual people standing on both sides of that border, they are the Ambo people. They share the exact same deep culture. They experience the exact same climate. They have the same ancestors, the same language, the same deeply rooted traditions. I mean, the dirt under their feet is completely identical.
The soil is the same, the weather's the same, yeah.
The absolutely singular difference between the people living in the bright light and the people living in the dark is the national flag flying hundreds of miles away in a distant capital city.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is. And for decades, economists have pointed to that specific light on the border and said, look, proof. Good laws and good governments create wealth. Case closed.
And, I mean, today we are opening up a massive economic study that basically proves that light was lying to us.
Totally lying. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are tearing into a monumental paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's called National Institutions and Subnational Development in Africa. And our mission today, we're taking that foundational theory that a piece of paper in a distant capital city dictates your wealth, and we're running it through the ultimate natural experiment.
Yeah, and you're completely right to start with that image from space because that visual is so incredibly compelling that it is essentially anchored modern macroeconomic theory for a very long time. Like the prevailing consensus, the textbook explanation you will find in literally any university economics department, is this idea of institutional determinism.
Which basically means laws equal money.
Exactly. The idea is that formal national institutions are the primary engine of wealth. So if a country has strong property rights, if it has impartial courts, if it has constraints on executive power, it will prosper. And if it lacks those things, it will fail. Geographic accidents, like which side of an invisible border your ancestors happen to settle on, are thought to dictate your economic fate entirely because of the laws written in the capital.
But the reality on the ground is, well, it's vastly more complicated than a textbook scatter plot. I mean, we're bringing you satellite data that measures human activity down to the square kilometer today. We're overlaying historical maps from the 1800s. We've got micro-surveys of tens of thousands of individuals.
We are going to test if the power of the state actually exists where it claims to exist.
Yes, because to understand how a natural experiment of this sheer magnitude even became possible, we really have to talk about the historical trauma that set the stage. Like, we have to look at the Berlin Conference of 1884.
Yeah, the straight-line borders.
Right. So picture the scene. You've got these European diplomats, monarchs, colonizers, all sitting around these heavy wooden tables in Berlin, and they have these massive, mostly blank maps of the African continent unrolled right in front of them.
Blank to them, anyway.
Right, exactly, blank to them. And they are taking literal straight-edge rulers to a complex, interwoven root system of human geography. They were drawing borders across territories where no European had ever even set foot.
It was purely just to divide the continent into spheres of influence so they wouldn't fight each other.
Right, it was just a giant geopolitical monopoly board.
Right.
And the sheer administrative arrogance of it is, well, it's still staggering to comprehend today. They carved up an entire continent based on the geometry of their rulers.
Literally, they're wooden rulers.
Yes. Not the reality of the terrain. When you look at the data today, nearly 80% of African borders were drawn along totally arbitrary latitudinal and longitudinal lines. It is the highest percentage of straight-line borders of any landmass on Earth.
Which is just a staggering statistic.
And I want you to think about what that means for the people actually living there. It's like taking a massive, thriving forest ecosystem and just dropping a concrete wall right through the middle of a river valley. It ripped trade networks apart. It severed migratory grazing routes.
And most devastatingly, it forced 40% of the African population into divided cross-border ethnic groups.
40%. You had entire unified communities who woke up one morning to find that half of their families family was now suddenly like French subjects, and the other half across the river were now British or Portuguese subjects. It was a historical trauma of just unfathomable proportions.
It was a geopolitical catastrophe.
Yeah.
But, and this is the core of the study, unexpectedly, this specific colonial ghost left behind a structurally perfect scientific laboratory for economists over a century later.
A very dark silver lining, but yeah.
Right. The tragedy of those straight lines essentially created a control group and a treatment group on a continental scale.
So we are setting this up to answer a very fundamental question for you. If you take a unified, historically integrated community and you drop an invisible wall right in the middle of them, forcing one half to obey a functional government and the other half to obey a dysfunctional government, what actually happens to their money? Do the good laws actually make the people on the good side richer?
And the methodological hurdle here is massive. Like, if you want to know if national institutions make people wealthier, the traditional approach is just to simply compare national GDPs, right? You take a country with a robust, independent judiciary and compare its gross domestic product to a country where the courts are highly corrupt.
But we immediately run into a brick wall there, because how can you possibly measure the granular village-level wealth of a rural community in the African hinterlands when the official national GDP numbers are, well, they're often completely unreliable?
That is the core problem. African official GDP statistics, especially at the subnational level, have historically suffered from severe distortions. You have states that literally lack the physical bureaucratic capacity to measure rural economic activity.
They just don't have the people to go out and count.
Exactly. And more critically, you have governments that have direct political incentives to lie. They inflate their growth numbers to look good for international organizations, or they deflate them to secure more foreign aid.
It's all just statistical propaganda.
Right. You cannot run a precise causal scientific test using fake numbers. You need an objective metric.
So the researchers completely bypass the national ministries of finance. They bypass the governments entirely, and they look down from space.
This is where the data revolution of this study comes into play. The researchers utilized the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program, specifically the Operational Line Scan System. And they used time-stable satellite nightlight density as their proxy for economic development.
Okay, let's explain how this actually works, because it isn't just, an astronaut snapping an iPhone photo from the International Space Station. These satellites are capturing images of the Earth at night, specifically between 8:00 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. local time. And they are collecting data at a hyper-granular level.
We're talking pixel by pixel.
Pixel by pixel. With each pixel representing roughly 1 square kilometer of land, the sensors detect luminosity from human settlements.
And crucially, they filter out the noise. The data set isn't just raw light. The algorithms drop images that are obscured by cloud cover. They filter out the aurora borealis and solar glare.
That's crazy they even have to account for that.
Oh, yeah. They even remove ephemeral lights, meaning things that don't represent permanent economic infrastructure. So they filter out seasonal forest fires, agricultural burning, lightning strikes.
So what remains is just the pure, unmanipulated, permanent glow of human economic activity. Streetlights, illuminated buildings, industrial facilities. But hold on. Does a glowing light actually mean a person is wealthier? Like, if I live in a rural village with no streetlights, does that mean my life is definitively worse than someone living under a halogen bulb?
Well, the researchers anticipated that exact critique. They didn't just assume light equals wealth. They cross-validated the satellite data with exhaustive microsurveys on the ground.
So they checked their work.
Right. And they found that the intensity of nightlights correlates incredibly strongly with the physical presence of public goods. Where the pixels are brighter, you naturally find better access to the electricity grid, obviously. But you also find a statistically significant increase in the presence of modern sewage systems, reliable access to piped water, and more years of formal schooling.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a highly accurate, completely objective proxy for broad human development.
So we have our objective metric, the unblinking eye of the satellite. Now, how do we construct the laboratory? The study zeroes in on exactly 220 distinct ethnic groups that were sliced in half by those arbitrary, straight-line colonial borders we talked about.
And to identify them, the researchers utilized this pioneering anthropological map created by George Peter Murdoch back in 1959. Murdoch painstakingly mapped the historical homelands of African ethnicities as they existed before European colonization.
So they have the pre-1884 map.
Right. And then the researchers overlaid that 1959 historical map directly onto the modern political map of Africa.
And the result is a highly specific data set. They identified 507 distinct country ethnicity observations. When you break that down into those 1 square kilometer satellite pixels we just discussed, it yields over 42,000 individual data points focused entirely within these partitioned homelands.
And this setup is it's brilliant.
Yeah.
Because it neutralizes almost every single variable that development economists usually argue about.
Yes. Because if one country is richer than another, someone will always say, well, they have better soil, or they have a milder climate, or they don't have to deal with malaria. But by looking strictly at these 220 split borders, geography is entirely neutralized.
It is the exact same terrain on both sides of the line.
Climate is identical. The disease environment, the prevalence of malaria or sleeping sickness is exactly the same. The genetics, the language, the deep cultural history, they are literally the same tribe.
And the researchers rigorously tested this assumption too, just to ensure these split territories were valid counterfactuals for one another. They ran extensive regression models, checking for differences in elevation, land suitability for agriculture, distance to the coast, even the presence of subsurface wealth like diamond mines or oil fields.
And what did they find?
The differences across the border within the bounds of a single ethnic homeland were statistically zero. The two sides are identical twins.
So the absolute only variable that changes when you step across that line in the dirt is the national flag flying over you. One half of the village is forced to obey the Constitution, the property rights, and the court system of country A, and the other half is governed by country B.
It represents the absolute holy grail of causal inference in economics. We have isolated the formal institution from every other confounding factor.
Okay, so let's test the textbook. The standard economic model asserts that better property rights plus better courts equals more money. If you take all the countries in Africa and run a simple cross-country scatter plotting their national rule of law score on the bottom axis and their average nightlight density on the side axis, you see a clear upward sloping line.
Yeah, as the national institutions get better, the country gets brighter.
Right. And if a researcher stopped their analysis right there at the macro level, they would publish a paper declaring that the institutional theory is perfectly validated, the national laws clearly drive prosperity.
Which brings us back to the Ambo people, that visual we started with. They are partitioned right down the middle by the border between Angola and Namibia, and this specific border is often held up as the ultimate proof of that textbook theory.
Let's look at the institutional scores of those two nations during this study period. Angola is a state that scores exceptionally low on almost every metric of institutional quality. It's historically struggled with severe corruption, weak property protections, a lack of constraints on executive power.
While Namibia, conversely, is widely considered a beacon of African institutional success. It boasts high rule of law scores, an independent judiciary, effective control of corruption.
And the satellites confirm the narrative perfectly. The nighttime lights on the Namibia side of the Ambo homeland are blindingly bright compared to the Angolan side. We are talking about an average luminosity of 0.162 on the Namibia side versus 0.0504 on the Angola side.
Namibia is more than 3 times brighter.
So case closed, right. The formal institutions appear to be working flawlessly. The people on the Namibian side have access to a functional legal framework, which encourages investment, which builds infrastructure, which turns on the lights. The textbook is right. We should just export Namibian legal codes to Angola and wait for the lights to turn on.
And that is the exact trap that development policy has fallen into for decades.
The trap.
Yes. What we just did with the Ambo tribe is a textbook example of survivor bias. Yes, the Namibia side is brighter, but using a single case study, a single border discontinuity to prove a continent-wide macroeconomic theory is a statistical illusion.
A total illusion.
When you stop cherry-picking the specific borders that confirm your pre-existing bias and actually look at the full data set of all 220 split groups, the entire narrative just shatters.
So show me the shatter. Give me an example of a border where the textbook gets thrown completely out the window.
Okay, let's examine the Kaonda people. Their ancestral homeland is split between Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC.
Just To provide the political context here for you listening, Zambia is a nation with relatively robust, functioning national institutions. It holds regular elections, maintains a functional legal system, provides basic public goods. The DRC, particularly during the period the satellite data was captured, is often cited as the epitome of institutional collapse.
Right.
It suffered from catastrophic corruption, virtually non-existent property rights outside the capital, and a state apparatus that functioned more as a predatory extraction mechanism than a government.
So, based on the institutional determinism theory, the Zambian side of the Kaonde homeland should be a glowing beacon of prosperity from space, and the DRC side should be completely dark.
Let me guess. It's not.
It is the exact opposite.
Wait, what?
The Kaonde people living in the DRC, the side with the broken, dysfunctional, predatory national government, are noticeably and statistically brighter at night than their exact cousins living under the stable laws of Zambia.
That is a total brain breaker. How can a society living under total institutional chaos generate more visible economic activity than a society living under the rule of law? Is it just a weird fluke with the Conde? Maybe there's a specific mining town on the DRC side throwing the data off?
It is not a fluke at all. The exact same reversal happens in West Africa with the Ani people, who are partitioned between Ghana and the Ivory Coast. Now, Ghana is the darling of institutional economists. It has a great rule of law score, roughly negative 0.23, which is quite strong for the region. The Ivory Coast at the time had terrible institutional scores, down at negative 1.25.
So the Ghanaian side of the Ani homeland should be much brighter.
But the data shows that 60% of the populated pixels on the Ivory Coast side of the Ani homeland are illuminated, compared to only 30% on the well-governed Ghanaian side.
Wait, so the side of the border with the objectively worse national laws is twice as bright?
Twice as bright.
This is the moment the study really just dismantles our assumptions. The researchers didn't just stop at the Ambo, the Kaonde, or the Ani. They took all 42,000 pixels across all 220 split tribes and plugged them into a massive regression model. And they introduced a statistical mechanism, which they call ethnicity fixed effects.
And the concept of fixed effects is crucial to understand here. Imagine you're trying to figure out if a new type of fertilizer makes plants grow taller. You could just measure all the plants in a massive field, but some plants might be in a sunny spot and some might be in the shade. To really know if the fertilizer works, you have to compare plants that are in the exact same patch of soil, getting the exact same amount of sunlight.
So by applying ethnicity fixed effects, the researchers are basically mathematically forcing the model to only compare pixels within the same ethnic homeland. It stops comparing a pixel in highly developed South Africa to a pixel in the Sahara Desert, and instead only compares the Namibian Ambo to the Angolan Ambo, the Zambian Kaonde to the Congolese Kaonde, across all 220 groups.
Right. It holds the local soil, the deep culture, and the geography perfectly constant.
And when they run that model, what happens to that beautiful upward-sloping textbook scatter plot we discussed earlier?
Yeah.
The one that proved good laws equal more wealth.
It completely collapses.
Unbelievable.
The explanatory power of the national rule of law plummets by over 70%. The statistical significance of national institutions, things like property rights, court independence, and corruption control, hits absolute zero.
Zero.
Zero. Once you control for the deep cultural history and the local geography of the specific dirt you are standing on, the flag flying over the capital city has literally zero statistical power to explain whether your village is lit up at night or completely dark.
I want to make sure I'm fully grasping the magnitude of this. Are you saying that all those cross-country studies showing that good institutions create wealth were just wrong?
Well, the study suggests that the broad national prosperity we thought was caused by good laws was largely an illusion of scale. When you run a simple cross-country regression, you aren't actually isolating the power of the Constitution. You are seeing a mirage.
A mirage.
Yeah, the wealth was primarily driven by favorable geography, historical trade routes, and deep pre-colonial cultural norms that encourage commerce. The formal institutions in the capital city were basically just taking credit for the sunshine.
Okay, I have to pause here and voice a major objection because my brain is really trying to rescue the textbook theory right now. Let's imagine a scenario. Let's say I live in a rural village right on the border of a terrible, corrupt country. The police extort me, my property isn't safe, and the economy is a mess. But literally 1 mile away, across a shallow river or dirt road, is a country with amazing property rights, fair judges, and a booming economy. Humans are rational actors. Wouldn't all the smart, ambitious people in my village just pack up their bags and walk a few miles across the border to the good side?
That is the migration hypothesis.
Right. Doesn't migration smooth out the lights? If everyone moves to the good side to work, but maybe they still trade with the bad side, or maybe the economic activity just spills over the border, are the satellites just seeing a blurred reality because people are constantly moving back and forth seeking better laws?
It's a highly logical mechanism to propose, and the researchers absolutely rigorously tested it. If the migration hypothesis were true, if people were actively fleeing the bad institutions to live under the umbrella of the good ones, you would expect to see a massive demographic shift.
You'd see a huge crowd at the border.
Right, you would see a spike in population density right on the border of the good country as people bottlenecked just inside the safe zone.
A concentration of economic refugees seeking the rule of law.
Exactly. To test this, the researchers pulled highly detailed UN grid population data. They mapped the population density of these split ethnic groups, pixel by pixel, right up to the exact 0 point of the border. And they found no spike whatsoever.
Nothing.
Nothing. The population density on the good institution side is identical to the population density on the bad institution side. There's absolutely no systematic difference in where people choose to live.
So despite the massive difference in the quality of the national laws, people are not physically moving across the border to seek them out.
People are staying exactly where they are.
Okay, well, what about the physical light itself? Even if people don't move, maybe a massive, prosperous city on the border of the good country is shining so brightly that the light pollution just bleeds over the border, making the bad side look richer than it actually is.
They accounted for light bleeding and economic spillover using a technique called a spatial discontinuity regression.
Which sounds incredibly complicated.
It just means imagine walking from the deep interior of a country toward the border, and you're carrying a light meter. The researchers mapped the light curve 50 kilometers out from the border, then 25 kilometers out, measuring all the way up to the exact 0 point of the dividing line.
Okay, so if the national laws truly mattered, what should that light meter show as you cross the line?
Well, if institutions dictate wealth, you would see a cliff. A sudden, dramatic step up in luminosity the absolute second you cross the invisible line from the bad country into the better country, because the legal regime has instantly changed.
And what does the data actually show at the 0 point?
A perfectly smooth, continuous curve. The national boundary, as legally profound as it may be on paper in the capital city, creates zero ripple in the actual economic prosperity on the ground.
That's incredible.
The transition is totally seamless. The laws simply do not matter in the dirt.
The implications of this are just staggering to me. I mean, the global community spends billions of dollars every year on foreign aid, on structural adjustment programs, on what we call capacity building. It is all predicated on this fundamental belief that if we can just help a developing nation fix its national laws, rewrite the Constitution, train the judges, implement property registries, the rural areas will naturally flourish.
Yeah.
And this satellite data is looking at that entire paradigm and basically saying, nope.
It is a profound challenge to the core assumptions of development economics, for sure.
Yeah.
However, we have to be precise about what the data is actually claiming. The study does not conclude that national laws never matter anywhere on the planet. It concludes that on average, across the African continent's partitioned hinterlands, they have zero statistical effect.
But do they ever matter within Africa? You brought up the Ambo people earlier, where the Namibian side really was 3 times brighter than the Angolan side. Does that mean the textbook theory works occasionally?
Right, this brings us to the heterogeneity of the data. The researchers didn't just look at the continent as a single homogeneous block. They broke the data down by region and generated a heat map to see where institutions might actually be moving the needle.
So paint that heat map for me. Where do the laws actually work?
Well, in East Africa, the effect is 0. In West Africa, the effect is 0. In Central Africa, practically 0. In North Africa, the data actually shows a slightly negative effect, though the sample size of split tribes there is much smaller. But Southern Africa, places like Botswana, South Africa, and Namibia, is the sole glaring exception.
Really?
Yeah. In the Southern African region, the side of the border with the better national institutions actually is significantly brighter.
So Southern Africa is the only place where the textbook actually applies.
Correct. And this regional variation is exactly why cherry-picking single case studies is so incredibly dangerous to our understanding of the world. If a researcher only studies the border between South Africa and Mozambique, or the border between Botswana and Zimbabwe, they will write a brilliant, empirically sound paper proving that national institutions are the ultimate key to prosperity.
And they'll win awards for it.
They will win awards for it, and they will be completely, fundamentally wrong about how the rest of the continent operates.
Okay, I want to dig into the exact percentages of these split tribes, because there is a statistical mystery hidden in this data that completely defies logic. Break down the 220 tribes for me.
So out of all the partitioned ethnic groups across the continent, in 62.5% of them, the national government has absolutely zero statistical effect on their prosperity. Good country, bad country, the lights glow at the exact same intensity.
That is a solid majority of the continent's borderlands just completely ignoring the existence of the capital city.
Then, in about 20% of the cases, which are heavily clustered in that Southern African exception we just discussed, better national institutions do lead to brighter nightlights.
Okay, so 62% see no effect, 20% see a positive effect. That leaves roughly 17% of the tribes unaccounted for.
Yes. And this is the anomaly that forces us to question everything. In a staggering 17.3% of the split tribes, the side of the border with the objectively worst national institutions is actually brighter.
I need you to explain the mechanics of how that is physically possible. How does bad governance breed brighter lights? How does a society get richer when the state is more corrupt and property rights are weaker? Are people actively fleeing the formal rule of law to do business in the shadows? Like, hey, the police in this country are so corrupt they don't even bother to collect taxes or enforce permits. Let's open a factory over there.
Well, it forces us to look beyond the formal legal code and examine the reality of survival. If a formal state is incredibly predatory, if it uses its laws not to protect citizens but to extract wealth from them, or if its bureaucracy is so stifling and complex that it chokes the life out of formal business creation, human beings do not just sit down and starve. They innovate, they adapt, they move their economic activity entirely into the informal economy.
The black market or the gray market?
Exactly. And in a country with completely collapsed formal institutions, like the DRC during the study period, the informal economy might actually have more room to breathe. There is no state apparatus strong enough to enforce stifling regulations or extract crippling taxes. The absence of the state creates a vacuum, and sheer human survival instinct fills it with informal, unregulated commerce.
That is incredibly counterintuitive, but I guess it makes perfect sense on the ground. A bad law enforced poorly is sometimes better for a small trader than a bad law enforced perfectly.
Furthermore, if the capital city is purely a place of extraction, the people living in the hinterlands might deliberately orient their economic lives to avoid it entirely. They might rely on ancient pre-colonial trade networks that operate horizontally across the landscape, completely ignoring the straight vertical lines drawn in 1884.
Which brings us to the most critical question of this entire deep dive. How does a beautifully written European-style constitution, a document with a clear separation of powers, an independent judiciary, and a mandate for national property registries, how does it just dissolve into thin air in the African wilderness?
To understand that dissolution, we have to look at the literal physics of power. There is a legendary, incredibly revealing quote from a senior government official in the Central African Republic. When a researcher asked him about the actual reach of his government's authority, the official bluntly replied, "The state stops at PK 12 kilometers from the capital city of Bangui."
12 kilometers. I mean, a fit person could run that distance in an hour. And he's openly admitting that beyond that 1 hour radius, the national government is a ghost.
This phenomenon is known in political science as the distance decay of institutional effectiveness. And the researchers didn't just take that official's word for it, they mapped it. They plotted the explanatory power of national institutions against the exact physical distance from the capital city, using 12,209 distinct tribal pixels to map the curve.
What does the shape of state power look like on a graph?
It looks like a steep, terrifying cliff. If your specific tribe lives in close physical proximity to the capital city, the entire data set flips. Near the capital, good national institutions absolutely generate wealth. The rule of law works perfectly. The courts function, property is protected, and the lights are bright. But the physical radiation of that state power has a microscopic radius. As you step further away from the capital, moving into the hinterlands, the statistical significance of those laws plunges off a cliff.
It makes me think of a Wi-Fi router in a very large house.
That's a great way to think about it.
Right. If you were sitting in the living room, right next to the router, which is the capital city, your connection is absolutely perfect. You have 5 bars. The laws protect you, the courts work, you can download wealth and prosperity instantly. But if you walk out the back door, past the patio, and into the far corner of the backyard, the hinterland, your phone shows 0 bars. You have no connection whatsoever. And the cruel irony is, it doesn't matter how expensive or advanced that Wi-Fi router is, a $1,000 state-of-the-art router and a broken $10 router both give you the exact same 0 bars when you are standing in the deep woods.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism of distance decay. The formal institution, the Constitution, is the broadband package. But if the state has built no physical infrastructure to broadcast that signal, if there are no paved roads connecting the village to the capital, there are no local police stations, if there are no state-paid magistrates sitting in the rural courthouses, the signal evaporates into the dirt.
The law is just a piece of paper sitting in a filing cabinet 500 miles away. It has no physical weight.
And the researchers sought to prove this evaporation using microevidence, not just satellites. They tapped into the Afrobarometer data from 2005.
So we are zooming all the way in. We are moving from satellites looking at pixels from space down to actual human beings sitting in their villages filling out surveys.
Exactly. The Afrobarometer is a massive Pan-African series of public attitude surveys. The researchers analyzed responses of tens of thousands of individuals across 17 different sub-Saharan countries. And crucially, they mapped every single response based on the individual's exact physical distance, both absolute and relative, to their nation's capital city.
What specific questions were they asking to test the Wi-Fi signal of the state?
They wanted to measure the lived experience of the law. They asked questions like, how likely is it that the formal authorities will enforce the law if a major crime is committed in your area? And how likely is it that the authorities will enforce the law if you evade your national taxes?
They are measuring the actual physical presence of consequence. Because a law without consequence isn't a law, it's just a suggestion.
And the survey results mirror the satellite light data perfectly. The perception that the state will enforce the law for major crimes drops in a sharp, monotonous line as you move physically away from the capital.
A straight line down into lawlessness.
The same is true for taxation. In the vast rural hinterlands, the perceived cost of evading national taxes or breaking formal state laws approaches absolute zero. The citizens know the state isn't coming for them. The paper laws simply do not exist in the lived reality of the people at the margins.
But this creates a massive logical paradox for me. Nature abhors a vacuum. If the national government isn't running the countryside, if the formal courts don't exist, and the police don't answer the phone, who's maintaining order? Someone has to be resolving property disputes. Someone has to be enforcing trade contracts. If it was pure unadulterated anarchy, there wouldn't be any nightlights at all. It would just be chaotic violence. So who is actually ruling the dark zones?
This brings us to the degeneration of the state and the revelation of who the true rulers of the African hinterland actually are. The Afrobarometer data revealed a profound shift in human psychology and identity the further you get from the capital. The surveyors asked people a very simple, direct question. Do you identify primarily as a citizen of your modern nation, or do you identify primarily as a member of your ethnic group?
The ultimate choice, nation versus tribe.
The data reveals a massive, undeniable seesaw effect. As the physical distance from the capital increases, the percentage of people who proudly identify as citizens of the nation plummets sharply. Simultaneously, tribal and ethnic identity skyrockets.
When you think about it, that is the most rational human response possible. If the formal state fails to provide the most basic public goods, if it doesn't pave your roads, if the police extort you instead of protecting you, if the courts are a 500-mile walk away, why on earth would you identify with that state? Humans naturally retreat to the nearest source of security. When the state fails, you retreat to your bloodlines, you retreat to the local structures that will actually keep you safe.
And those local structures have deeply entrenched leaders. To measure the power of these local structures, the researchers went back to George Peter Murdoch's historical work. They utilized his index of pre-colonial political centralization. Murdoch had meticulously categorized African societies as they existed before the Europeans arrived, grading them on a scale from 0 to 4.
What do the numbers represent?
A score of 0 represents an acephalous or stateless society. These were small, decentralized kinship groups without a formal hierarchy. A score of 4 represents a large, highly complex, centralized pre-colonial state, like the Kingdom of Congo or the Ashanti Empire, with complex taxation, standing armies, and deep legal traditions.
So they are looking at the invisible power structures that existed centuries before the Europeans showed up with their straight-edge rulers and maps.
Precisely. And when they overlaid that historical centralization index onto the modern satellite data, they found the missing variable. The true dictator of modern prosperity in the African hinterland isn't the current president sitting in the capital. It is the historical power of traditional chiefs and customary law.
I want to make sure I'm grasping the temporal scale of this. You are telling me that the brightness of a light bulb seen from space in 2008 is being dictated like the political complexity of a tribal kingdom that existed in 1850.
Yes. When the researchers mathematically controlled for that pre-colonial centralization, the already weak effect of modern national institutions dropped even further. The echo of the historical chiefs is vastly louder than the broadcast of the modern state.
How does that actually work in practice? If two farmers in the hinterland have a dispute over where one field ends and another begins, what happens?
Well, in the capital city, they might hire lawyers and go to a formal state court, navigating a legal code written in French or English. In the hinterland, they go to the traditional chief. The chief adjudicates the dispute based on unwritten customary law, relying on community consensus and historical precedent. The chief has the social legitimacy to enforce the ruling, a legitimacy that the distant national government completely lacks.
This means we have to completely change our vocabulary. We lazily refer to these countries as broken states or failed states, but they aren't broken, they are just operating a dual system.
Right. The data provides undeniable empirical proof for Arthur Lewis's theory of the dual economy. He posited that developing nations don't have a single unified economy. They have two completely different dimensions operating simultaneously within the exact same geographical borders.
You have the capital circle, the modern dimension. It operates on formal legal frameworks. It has stock exchanges. Politicians read the Constitution, pass bills, and interact with the global economy. And then, completely disconnected from that reality, you have the vast, sprawling, rural hinterlands. And we aren't talking about a small minority of people here. A massive 45% of the continent's population lives in these rural areas, operating entirely in the dark, governed not by the state, but by customary law and traditional chiefs.
Which brings us to the ultimate enduring tragedy of the empty show. The real crime of the Berlin Conference in 1884 wasn't merely that the straight lines sliced unified ethnic groups in half. The deeper structural crime is that those straight lines locked massive, sprawling, logically impossible geographies into artificial nations.
They took a pen, drew a massive box around an area the size of Western Europe, an area filled with impenetrable rainforests, harsh deserts, and disconnected river systems, and said, "Congratulations, you are now a unified modern nation-state. Go enforce the law."
By drawing borders so vast and arbitrary, the colonizers doomed these new states to be empty shells. They structurally guaranteed that the central government would forever be physically incapable of broadcasting power to its own borders. The tragedy was baked into the very geometry of the map.
The straight edge of the colonial ruler doomed these countries to a hollow existence.
The state stops at PK 12, 12 kilometers from the capital, because the colonial state was never actually designed to reach PK 13. It was designed purely as an extraction mechanism. The colonial powers built roads from the mines to the coast and from the capital to the ports. They never built the infrastructure to integrate the hinterland. The formal institutions were always a facade. And our microeconomic models, by assuming that facade was real, have been hallucinating for decades.
This is exactly why this specific deep dive is so vital. We love to sit around in comfortable air-conditioned rooms and debate the nuances of macroeconomic policy. We argue about marginal tax rates, the exact phrasing of legal frameworks, and whether a constitution should emphasize this right or that right. But this study strips all of that away and proves a fundamental, brutally simple human truth. A law is just a piece of paper if you lack the physical reality to enforce it.
It is the ultimate reality check for institutionalism.
If you are designing a system, whether it is a new business, a local community organization, or a sovereign country, your rules only matter as far as your actual physical presence reaches. Your authority does not extend one single inch past your capacity to connect with the people you claim to lead.
If we take the insights from this data and apply them to the broader picture of global development, it forces us to completely reevaluate our approach. You cannot simply copy and paste a Western legal code, complete with complex property registries and appellate courts, into a post-colonial empty shell and expect the lights to suddenly turn on. You have to understand the soil. You have to understand the customary law, the traditional power of the chiefs, and the physical limitations of the geography. You have to build the literal infrastructure of presence before you can ever hope to build the infrastructure of paper.
I want to take this entire concept, pull it out of the 1884 Berlin Conference, and drop it directly into the reality we are living in today. Because history doesn't repeat, but it echoes. Are we drawing new straight lines right now? Think about the digital borders being drawn across the globe today by transnational tech giants and AI ecosystems. The new capital cities of the world aren't in Europe anymore. They are the server farms of Silicon Valley. Those servers are writing the terms of service, the algorithms, the new laws of the digital age.
That is a profound parallel, and it raises a critical question about who's being left in the new hinterlands.
Exactly. If you lack the digital infrastructure, if you don't have access to high-speed broadband, or if your local economy lacks the capital to integrate into these massive AI ecosystems, you are living in the new digital hinterland. As the formal powers of traditional national governments continue to retreat in the face of these transnational tech monopolies, are we facing a massive, unprecedented wave of global segregation? We aren't being separated by a physical straight line drawn by a guy with a mustache in Berlin anymore. We are being separated by a digital divide, a new geography where the state's power and the opportunity for prosperity simply evaporates the moment you step past the edge of the Wi-Fi signal. Think about where you are sitting on that map right now. Imagine an invisible line drawn in the digital dirt. Which side of the line are you on?